accessible HTML, why it's important to us, and a few other things like that. So I'm starting with something of a, well, I have my prejudices, but I'm trying to start with an open mind. And I'm trying to be evidence-based rather than leaping straight to my favorite predilections in terms of doing things. So today's session will have three parts. The first is I'm going to sort of discuss the questions and the motivations. There'll be an opportunity for discussion after that. Then I'll show I'll do some screen sharing to show the investigations I've done. And then I'll stop screen sharing and we can discuss, and I'll be discussing about, I hope to have your participation in a discussion as to how we can go forward in the future. And it might be do me more research, or it isn't needed, or whatever, but we'll come to that when we get there. So one of the motivations for this is actually with LaTeX. LaTeX doesn't write PDF directly. It uses a library that writes PDF. So that's quite common in computing, is that whenever you have a file format, you have a library that reads that file format, but doesn't do anything else with it, and writes that file format from a suitable internal representation. So in our case, our file format is HTML, more specifically accessible HTML. And if we could have a HTML writer that makes it easier to do the accessibility things we want to do, and which can provide checks that things are and aren't being done. So for example, the absence of captions, where captions should be there, should be in some sense part of the job of the writer, or at least optionally part of the job of the writer. Checking internal links actually work is part of the writer. So if you're linking to another part of the website, the writer should check that. And similarly, it should do some accessibility checking. So I'm approached this with the question, is there a standard tool for writing accessible HTML? And even if I think I know the answer, one should make an effort to look for it, because you never know what you'll find. And we're trying to be evidence-based rather than this is what I know based. And what do I mean by that? Well, it should handle all the various rules and practices and checks that accessible HTML should have. And the output should be accessible, or at least as light, so insofar as a machine can tell. So it's not as though it's impossible to game the system, slip something through that isn't accessible, but we want it to be sufficiently accessible enough of the time that it be useful. And Charles has hopefully given us a link to the W3C accessibility guidelines. In a certain sense, one of the purposes of this tool is that the developers of that tool read those guidelines and understand those guidelines, so that the people who are using the tool don't have to.
The problem is there's a great deal of information there, and it's not a simple topic.
Yes, and there's something to be said for solving the simple parts of your problem first.
Sure,
without pretending that the whole thing.
Sure, but the W3C tends to be very good at gathering the experts in the field. And although I say it's not a simple topic, their standards, generally, how do I put this? Generally provide a good path for what you should be doing.
I'd agree with that statement. So the question I posed becomes refined, which is, are there any tools for writing HTML that conform to the W3C guidelines?
Ooh, that's perhaps That's perhaps not a well-formed question. Because it assumes that one can devolve the responsibility for accessibility onto some tool. Like I could write a program to make HTML accessible. And while I believe one could create HTML author tools that assist in this process, and it's even more complicated than that. And depending on whether I step out of my archive hat or not, you know, back when I was involved in the W3C, we would have had quite a lot of conversation about what was it? You know, Microsoft had its front page product, and Adobe had. I'm trying to remember the name of the product even for authoring HTML, and to some extent, those tools have become semi-irrelevant on the web because nobody. A tiny portion of the web nowadays is static HTML files. So what you really need to discuss is, you know, what accessibility features are there in the various toolkits, whether they be server side or client side. So how do you make WordPress accessible? You know, how do you make React accessible? And the problem is there's a plethora of such tools and kits, which means I don't think it's feasible to say we're going to create a particular tool to make the web, to make HTML accessible. It's too broad. It's like saying I could provide a tool to make buildings accessible. Right? You need to involve the architects and the contractor and stuff to, you know, and create specifications around the size of the ramp, etc. It's not like you're going to sell somebody a machine to make the ramps. Well, some companies might do that, but you know, that's not something you need to produce a standard tool for the industry for. It's disseminating knowledge to the people who are designing these systems and the content within the systems, and perhaps providing tooling support, but not I don't think there's a tool to be done out there.
Okay, let me tell you suggest a point for revisiting what you said, Charles, which is I've got a list of pages from American universities where they deal with accessible tables, and they have snippets from the W3C guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll look at those pages. I also want to make an apology, which is I wrote in my notes motivation, and I forgot to deal with that, and that will help narrow the scope quite helpfully. So one of my motivations is there are preprints on the archive that are going to the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the PNAS actually produces quite nice, in my opinion, HTML from effectively the LaTeX source.
Don't bet that there aren't humans in the loop there.
Oh, I bet there are. And
right.
Their service provider, which is a commercial company, I think it's called A-Type, I won't pronounce the name, processes the tables separately. They ask for the tables to be submitted separate from the main article. And
when you say tables, do you mean, you know, embedded tables that are in the content of the document?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So, you know, Kava's company does this, not specifically LaTeX XML to HTML conversion, but, you know, deals with, I know he does the American Physical Society and other publishers, but again, if APS gets their initial document in tech form, they enter it into his system with, I believe, a lot of you know, they have a staff that makes sure the papers come out okay.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate description, Kava? And am I mispronouncing your name well?
You're muted, Kava.
You're muted, Kava.
Sorry. No, that's a good pronunciation. Thank you. If I get your point, yes. So APS, we work with APS. We've actually built a system for APS where you can actually type into the system and XML is generated automatically.
Right. That's assuming that but do they feed ever feed tech into it if that's where they get their source from?
If you want there is no way that I know of to convert a generic LaTeX file to XML. So that needs manual intervention.
Well, okay, I mean, that's part of the problem we're all struggling with.
Correct.
But how much manual intervention? Completely retyping the article?
No. So we have I mean, if you like, our typesetting composition stuff is very small now. It's not a major part of our business. We're trying to, we're actually trying to get rid of typesetting if you like. So our staff, they'll get a tech file. They know tech very well. They will clean it up. They know, right. For example, they put the things in. But we've built a lot of systems. So, for example, they don't have to expand macros. A lot of companies will have to expand the macros. We auto expand the macros because it's macros. So it's done further down.
So Jonathan, there are many systems out there. My impression is, especially in the publishing industry, to do portions of this job, but none of them do a level of automatic conversion to HTML or XML that anybody would publish directly without having the humans come in and make it into a presentable document.
You've just drenched me with cold water. Thank you.
I'm sorry, because I'm looking for that automated solution at 15,000 articles a month. The solutions the publishers are using are inconceivable for the archive.
Yeah. The archive doesn't have staff, but it has a...
Well, we have staff, about 12 of them.
But you don't have staff that deal with individual articles.
Well, at times we do, but we can't do it on the level of actually cleaning up their, the HTML. We deal with the problematic articles. We give people what support we can when their tech isn't working, and other stuff like that. But there's, frankly, in that category, we have about 5 people to do that, and they're also answering all the other questions people have about the archive.
What you do have is a standing amongst authors and a sort of author engagement.
Correct, and I'm hoping to leverage that. I'm hoping to leverage that, but yeah. I'm we're still searching for the holy grail of the tool that can do a great LaTeX XML conversion.
Oh, okay, I'm going to backtrack to my motivation. Another of my motivation is the work that Charles and others are doing on the archive for accessibility, and it sort of influences my thinking. I'm not trying to solve your problem, but I want to be part of the solution. And then there are projects such as Tectonic and Stex that we saw last month that are generating HTML5. And if such projects could use a standard backend, that could make everything a lot easier. And that's really the motivation for trying to provide some sort of backend generator for HTML.
The problem is that you're assuming that can be done. A common theme amongst these projects, I wouldn't say a theme, but you may well have lost much of the. I don't think it can be just a back end.
Well, I'm not saying the back end can do everything, but if the back end can take responsibility for some of the tasks.
Well, so I have some students who've been testing what we identified as the 10 projects for creating HTML from TeX or LaTeX. And
I'm putting that to one side, and in a certain sense, it's complementary, because what you have is you have Project A that does its own front end, its own middle end, and its own back end, and you've got all of these projects with their own front end, their own middleware, and their own back end. And I'm trying to get some sort of. I think it would be very helpful to have a convergence of back end, so you could say, well, I don't know anything about CSS, but I like the styles there. So I use that person as styles. And if you're going to use the styles, you have to use the HTML generator as well, because the styles have to hook into something. So you shouldn't be able to look at, it's like the fonts. You have a sort of standard collection of fonts, and you shouldn't be able to look at the document and say, oh, from the fonts, I can tell that this must have been typeset by so-and-so. So from the visual appearance, you can say, oh, this must be produced by Al Walk. I'm exaggerating a bit there, but that's the sort of thinking I have, is a standard, fairly neutral tool that lots of people can use. I think what I'd like to do is move now on to some sharing. And this will just be, I think, a fairly quick run through the investigations I've done. So let me see if I can't share the screen. So let me do screen, sorry. How's that? We sharing? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just adjusting things. So I've added some stuff to the web page. It's a bit awkward for me. I wonder if one of you could put the URL for the web page for today into the chat so it's available for everybody. And what I've done is I've looked at some sites under underlying HTML just to get some idea of what's going on in practice. Now, the sites are not representative of STEM and scientific publishing. So this is snippets that we've brought. Now, I found those sites because I did a search for example accessible website. I think knowing what the good practice is very helpful. So I've got these 6 links here, one of which is the W3C site. And the top link is the link for the search that I did. I then searched for generating accessible HTML. And I have to say that that was a bit unrewarding. That searching for generating accessible HTML didn't produce much. I then looked for accessible HTML table example. And I found these things. And I then searched for generating accessible HTML, and I found something by Adam Wills that I will talk about again later. And finally, I searched for .edu accessible HTML table. And the first link there is the Google search link. And then the remaining 15 links are .edu, well, I've got .gov as well. I don't know how, sites, all of which seem to be telling people how to create accessible HTML file tables. And the pages seem to be, I haven't looked at them all, seem to be fairly basic, giving fairly basic tutorials, and they seem to be dated about 15 years ago, I'm guessing. And then the final thing is Adam Wills' HTML table generator, which seems to be entirely browser-based. One uploads a CSS, comma-separated value file, and then it generates an accessible, well, what it says is an accessible table from it, and it's done entirely within the browser. And I will demo that to you later while I'm sharing, because it really is very interesting. It was quite an eye-opener to me that you could do that. And because it's all in the browser, it reduces many obstacles to development, deployment, and use of this tool. One doesn't need a server to develop or deploy it. And people who are concerned that documents should not be uploaded to external sites or content, the commercial information, stuff that isn't published shouldn't be uploaded to external sites, can host this thing on their internal site because it's all running entirely within the web browser. So what I'd like to do now is to talk about the underlying HTML a bit. So these URLs came from the recommended sites, and they're, roughly speaking, they're sites for the ordinary person. So Scope has here's a button, and you notice that Accept All is the ARIA label, and it's also the text on the button. So anything that's generating accessible buttons will have to handle that sort of thing. And here they have something that's labeled by, and it's functional cookies. There's something interesting here, which is that functional cookies is the value of an attribute of a tag, and it's also part of the content. And we'll see another example. Well, we've seen one example here, which is the content and the tags that provide accessibility, the ARIA attributes that provide accessibility, are both similar in that they're content that is visible or audible to the user, rather than formatting information that affects the shape of the site, if you like. This is a US government site, and this is their button, which is behind the scenes considerably bigger. I'll draw attention to this line here. The class, it has a single class, and it's absolutely monstrous. The name is absolutely monstrous. Gem C layout, super navigation header, navigation top toggle button inner. I bet you nobody typed that one more than once. And the ARIA stuff is a bit, is sort of very little. There's ARIA expanded true, and then there's an ARIA label, hide navigation menu. So it's a button that hides the navigation menu, I believe. Patagonia sells outdoor clothing and other gear. Here we've got a form, and just here, ARIA label is presumably what you hear if you're using ARIA, search, keywords, etc. Now, this again is a piece of text that is heard by the reader. And so in some sense, it doesn't belong in the form. It's quite different from action, search, and method get, and many of the other values of the attributes. This is something that in another world might be thought of as content. Now, this is a W3C, what's the word? Tutorial on multi-level tables. I don't understand this, but here's a fragment of a multi-level table. And the Rome here is the city Rome. And these headers here are Rome. I'm not sure what our bed means. I think it's one bedroom. Studio, apartment, chalet, villa, I guess. And if the website offered holiday accommodation in other destinations, you'd have values other than Rome appearing here. So this value Rome could be any other city, which is, again, quite different from the way in which attributes normally work. So there we've got that. I'd like to show you Adam Will's HTML generator. So let's see if we can select a file. Here we go, sample.csv. I know it contains headings. Here we are, it generates the HTML. And here's the table. The data comes from Wikipedia. Now, what I find really interesting, quite apart from the fact that it runs entirely in the browser, is it's actually quite easy to use. You just say, here's your CSV file, you drop it in, and then you've got some HTML that you can use. And if I go back to, I'll just choose this one. I may not have seen this one before. So here it's saying what makes a table accessible: include a header row, use a simple table structure, add alt text to the table, avoid blank cells, don't use screenshots. How do I create accessible tables? Well, we've got various links here. If you're generating HTML, something like Will Adams' tool, provided it's got the capabilities required, seems to be great, because you could just say, go to this tool, drop your CSV in, adjust the parameters, and there's your table. Of course, if you're using Google Docs and you're creating the HTML through an interface that doesn't give you access to the HTML in the way that you do if you copy and paste HTML into HTML, then there are difficulties. But this is one example of the many pages that are out there on accessible tables. So this is search. I did accessible HTML tables, and I just took the first 15 examples that came up that seemed to be interesting. But there must be hundreds and hundreds of these websites across the universities. So that indicates to me that there's some sort of space in the market, let's put it that way, for a tool that works well on simple tables, but one would want it to have other characteristics as well, such as being extensible. So I'm going to stop the sharing now, if I can. And we can discuss this, and we can go back to the sharing if we want to. So I'm very much focused at the moment on the low end of the market. I'm just putting something up on a web page for something or the other, and I need to put a table in, and I want it to be accessible. And I'm assuming that I'm creating the HTML more or less by hand. So that's the sort of customer-facing, the user-facing, the author-facing thing that I'm looking at. But I'm wanting the back end that does the work to be extensible and something, an open source and all the other nice things. So that's where I've got to. I've got some questions about where I'm interested in going forward. And what struck me very, very strongly, and I wasn't expecting, was first of all, Will Adams' tool. That really is a game changer. The idea that you can upload some data to a tool and it will generate the accessible table for you. And that tool runs entirely in your browser. That is a really eye-opener for me. And the other thing was this long list of college websites, university websites, where they give people advice on how to create accessible tables, which seems to be, roughly speaking, the W3C guidelines simplified so that you don't need to know, you don't have to read them all. But what seems to be lacking, although I've not done a proper exploration, is what's the word? a tool like Will Adams, but with much more strength, so that it will generate 50% of the accessible tables that are needed for simple uses. I'm being very, very modest in my demands. So, and what I'm interested in, as well as solving a problem for users, is actually building a sort of community of people around it. And I'd like visually impaired people, particularly in visually impaired programmers, to have a great deal of ownership of such a tool. So that's one of the sort of design and architectural constraints. And it should be extensible, so that if there's a fault or if there's a missing feature, somebody could add it to their own version. And that's different from the situation that Charles is in, where he's got a large amount of sophisticated, complex content, some of which is tables, and he wants to translate it all. I'm just looking to make things a little bit better for a few people, or perhaps more than a few people. On the other hand, I've got fewer resources than Charles, so or the archive. So why don't I stop at that point and invite any comments that people want to make?
Okay. One thing that's, since I deal with enormous amounts of HTML from a great many sources, one thing that's always struck me is how dreadful it is. There's very little thought given to clean formatting, conformance to grammar. I mean, I've heard on the web statements that perhaps 99% of all web pages are malformed. They do not conform to the grammar. Most are missing a document type which describes the grammar file that is needed to process that file. And when XML was introduced back in the mid-1990s, the idea was that every XML file had to have a grammar file, and it had to be used to parse that file. And the viewer was required to reject the file if it did not pass the parse. The reality for HTML, however, is very different. Browsers look for tags that they recognize and ignore everything else. And they rarely follow standards for handling of white space and punctuation and so on. So it's really a pretty awful mess. And the thing is, if we're going to use other people's tools to generate HTML that's going to be dumped into our HTML, I think this matters. It has to be editable. It has to be cleanly formatted, grammatically conformant, and I don't see us finding that.
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to give Charles an opportunity to say what he wants. You're muted, Charles, I think. I can't hear you, Charles.
No, he hasn't muted, but he can't see.
Okay, this might be better.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I think I need to reboot my computer today. So Nelson, what you said about XML is not strictly true. And I say that as a former member of the W3C XML working group. The DTD, neither the DTD nor the XML schema declaration are required. If it is there, a conforming processor is supposed to validate the document against it and reject it. And indeed, this was a very deliberate choice by the XML working group, who are mostly a bunch of XSGML heads, to deal with the situation that developed in HTML, which I blame Netscape for, by the way. And I'm saying this not just because I was a member of the IE4 team and competing with Netscape at the time, but what Netscape did from the beginning is they chose to accept and display malformed HTML instead of rejecting it. So there was no feedback loop, and also, I can also say from my W3C dealings, when Tim Berners-Lee, and this is getting a little bit off topic, but since you've raised it, I might as well give some of the history here. When Tim Berners-Lee invented HTML, he did not expect or intend that people should continue authoring it by hand indefinitely. He thought there would be tooling developed to author the HTML, yet at the time I was participating in these activities circa 1997, which is, roughly 5 years after the creation of the web and when HTML and the web were getting insanely popular, right? Our own surveys at Microsoft found out that the most common tool people use to create their HTML was Notepad. And you just can't expect people to get it right in Notepad. And it's led to the situation we're in. We were also trying to innovate very quickly. I'll blame the IE team for some of it. You would think the HTML was designed by a lot of graybeards, carefully considering each thing that was done. No, it's created by a development team, largely at Microsoft, where we wanted to see just how powerful we could make web pages. and do it on a deadline because we needed to, introduce our next version of IE, not by the time or not long after Netscape introduced their next version of Netscape Navigator. It's the way startups do things. I will say that the other thing that horrified the people I was working with on the XML working group were from the SGML world, and this may be more relevant to your observation, is that they were horrified that Tim Berners-Lee defined a single grammar for HTML instead of using SGML where one could define many different grammars. I think I may have somewhat politely pointed out that it was probably what made the web successful, because he cut the complexity of the task down a great deal. The other problem is then the HTML standardization kind of wandered in the wilderness for a while. But HTML5 has brought us to a very good place, but that doesn't mean we can re-educate all of the authors out there who already knew how to do things and who are using a plethora of tools. And it's just, it is what it is. It's not the ideal system one would have designed, if you got some smart computer scientists in a room. There were plenty of smart computer scientists involved, but there were other priorities and lots of other activities going around, et cetera. That being said, the World Wide Web has succeeded beyond anyone's imagination from the early 90s, beyond what anyone could have dreamed in the early 90s, right? We're to some extent here talking and video conferencing because of the World Wide Web. It's not even if our particular conversation isn't in a web browser, the utility that the web brought to the world caused the world to get wired. So, c'est la vie, c'est la guerre.
I should have mentioned one other point about HTML one finds in the web. For many publishers in particular, it's riddled with JavaScript, and the JavaScript is expected to be acted upon to deal with extensions that particular publisher has chosen to add to the HTML. And this really means that not only can you not interpret HTML according to a grammar, you really have to interpret the JavaScript. The JavaScript is a full-blown programming language, and pretty much anything goes. So adds significant danger to all HTML pages. Exactly.
Yep.
So it's a tough problem.
On the issue of danger, one of the problems with informal generation of HTML is that you have to make great effort to escape things correctly. Otherwise, you get what are called injection attacks, and they keep on occurring. There was one a few years ago in the Apache Struts framework that caused a lot of difficulty. And that's because you're not doing things, so to speak, in a clean way. And From my point of view, I think that XSLT is actually quite a good tool for generating HTML. It may not succeed in
Yeah.
every account,
Yeah,
but it will generate valid HTML if you, or at least won't have malformed tags.
except companies like Microsoft let, and by the way, I was there at the time, but that was one of the few things on the XML team I wasn't responsible for. That was another program manager. You know, let you embed script code in XSLT, making it very it's opening up the door for the same kind of injection attacks you're talking about, Jonathan. But I don't think we should get deeply into a security conversation here, because that will get really deep.
I agree with your caution on that. I just mention it to underline the importance of not just gluing strings together.
To some extent, if I can bring this back around to tech,
Sure.
We don't need to try to solve the general problem of HTML in the World Wide Web, because we have a constrained problem where at least I don't know about the rest of you, intend to generate the HTML and by and large avoid passing stuff through directly to the output, which is where you have room for injection attacks. And that gives us a much more constrained, like there's no reason for us to generate malformed HTML. There's no reason for us to generate HTML that wouldn't conform to a schema were we to define the schema we wanted. Bear in mind that with the sort of dead-end XHTML effort, HTML 5.0 cannot be, is no longer a valid XML. HTML 5.0 documents are no longer to be required to also be valid XML documents. However, they're allowed to be. So if we were to write our own converters from scratch, we could certainly make sure that they are XML documents, which brings you good properties, like you can validate them. And you know, we could go full circle on this, but the main gap is just the fundamental question is getting that software written, and it's just not a simple project. It's not a simple thing to do in the current tech environment, given unlimited resources. And maybe this is the difference between what's in my head and what you're trying to do, Jonathan. Some of those, given unlimited resources, I would probably take a development team of 5 people and sit them down and say, write a completely new implementation of tech that can generate, you know, legacy DVI or PDF that exactly matches, you know, legacy tech, but also generates wonderful HTML. It's a doable project. It's just not an easy one. And there are all sorts of decisions you make along the way because of tech's, you know, typesetting focus. One has to make pragmatic choices when generating the HTML, and you could provide options of doing things, et cetera. My team was looking at a conversion just the other day where, you know, the placement of some of the text looked like it was completely different from the generated PDF file. And this is something where Christopher made a good observation, if he's still on the call, that the HTML document put the figure where it was defined in the linear flow of the text source, which is not necessarily where the text layout engine places it on in the printed page. And you know, it's a case where there almost isn't enough information to tell you how to do it right, because the expectation in a linear text document, linear HTML document, is that figure is very close to where, you know, you're supposed to look at it, right?
But I mean, that's tech. That's pagination for you. There's no room to put it there, so you float it to the next available space.
And people know from reading documents, and this also happened to be a 2-column document, which, you know, complicates the layout, right?
Mm-hmm.
People know to look for the floating figure, but we were all staring at the HTML version and saying we put the text in the wrong place. And then it's finally, oh no, the text is in the right place. The figure was dropped in the wrong place, so to speak. Now, you know, we need a feedback loop here, and if and when we manage to get HTML generated for the papers people upload to archive, we're going to show them the HTML and say, does it look right to you? And if it doesn't look right, we'll probably write some help text. And one of the things will be, did your figure come out in a strange place? Does it look like your text moved around? Check where you put the definition of that figure in your text source and maybe move it to a place that makes more sense, and you'll generate HTML that looks more correct to people, right?
Sorry, but isn't it, I mean, in the tech source, the figure should be exactly where it logically is.
The
Yeah,
problem,
so in the tech source, you put it exactly, that should be linear.
but
when
if it
when
looks,
you paginate, tech then very cleverly puts that figure aside and says, okay, have I got enough
Yes.
room here? No, I haven't. Take
Right.
it aside, fill it with as much as you can, put it in the next available space. That's how it works. And there are all kinds of controls as to whether you want it at the top of the next page.
but you
bottom.
understand, Kava, if the
Yeah.
author puts the definition a little off from where it really ought to be, they convert their document to PDF.
Yeah.
Looks fine to them, so there's no
Absolutely,
feedback
yeah.
to get them to fix it.
No, that's fair enough. That the author might think PDF looks good, but it's very bad practice to actually put.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same as accepting bad HTML.
Okay. Yep.
If you don't
fair
have
enough.
feedback loops for things, people, don't do the right thing.
Yep.
I'm going to come here explaining something a little bit about what's motivating me, which is that for several years now, I've been listening and occasionally participating in the visually impaired programmers list. And there are all sorts of concerns about programs and websites not being accessible. And it's a really, really big impediment. Now, clearly, Charles can't fix that, but knowing that these people have got these problems and seeing that they're a sort of highly motivated resource, if you like, makes me want to see if I can't help do some empowerment in terms of making it easier to generate accessible HTML in a restricted context, not, oh, I'm going to take this really complicated website and this tool will allow you to produce it in an accessible form. I mean, that's just sort of nonsense. But if one is, for example, designing from scratch to be accessible, then the tool should be able to help you and help guide you. And if the tools don't give you what you want, then you should be able to, in a disciplined way, extend them. So that's the sort of problem that I'm looking at, and I'm not an expert in accessibility by any means. What I'm looking to do is to create something that takes me a bit beyond where I am.
Jonathan, if you define the problem narrowly enough, you can do what you're saying. The issue is, and this was certainly true of the particular paper this is my students doing, their review of some of their initial research into generating HTML from text documents. It was a highly formatted document with a lot of math in it. And, you get, so you speak about simple conversions, but there was almost nothing simple about doing this document, about laying out this document. And I would love it if we could push back to the community somewhat and say, guys, give up on finely tuning the PDF layouts of your document. It's not the only format that matters, but that would require a lot of education. I mean, if we could do what you said, Jonathan, and put the feedback loop all the way back, I'd probably be having them author in JATS instead of TeX, like Kava's system does.
Yeah. Well, in some sense, Will Adams' tool that's why it's such revelation to me, is that it puts it right on the desktop. It puts it right in the browser to test your table for accessibility or convert your tabular data into what might be an accessible table.
I actually don't think the tables you're talking about, I don't think the level of accessibility that you demoed with uploading a CSV file and getting headers on the columns is a trivial level of accessibility.
Yeah, I agree that's trivial, but what's interesting, what struck me very strongly was that it was all happening inside the browser, and there's no particular reason why something considerably more sophisticated shouldn't take place with the same underlying technology. You just need a more powerful transformation.
I think you're confused. Confused is perhaps the wrong word. There's no longer such a large difference between what one can do inside a browser and what one can do in a desktop app. In fact, a lot of desktop apps nowadays are the browser version of the application packaged in as an Electron app and distributed. Do you like VS Code, Jonathan? Do you use it?
I use it a bit. I ought to use it more because the visually impaired programmers, it's their go-to tool. It's the tool that they really understand.
Well, guess what? VS Code. App. Yeah, it's an Electron app. It's essentially a web app.
Yeah, the difference is that if it's a web page, you don't have to install anything. You just visit the page, do it. There's this wonderful talk. I can't remember who it's by. People don't want to use your software; they want to have used your software.
Sure,
and if all they want to do, if all they need to do is create a table,
it's happening. One of my developers attended a Google Next talk today or yesterday. That was about their web-based IDE. They're going to make it essentially possible to build your entire application for the Google Cloud in using a rich IDE inside the web browser.
Yeah,
and we like this idea because I no longer have to install all this build stuff on my laptop. Yeah. I could create I could create all of Archive from a Chromebook.
Can I just throw a question out there, whether anyone has contacts at Overleaf? The suggestion
I was going to mention that.
Because writing a paper is not an individual endeavor often. It's often a team working together. Overleaf is a popular tool for co-writing, and that seems like such a wonderful place to also give feedback on what HTML might be produced from what you're doing. And I don't know if anybody has a really good friend at Overleaf. But it would be really interesting to speak to them.
Shamsi, we as the archive need to reach out to them again.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the things to do. And that would be closer to Jonathan's vision because that is the foremost tool.
Right. You're right, Shamsi. I think that this is based on conversations I had with people that use Overleaf. The support for collaboration is really very, very powerful. Powerful argument for using Overleaf. I think the other thing is you've got a standard tech environment so that you have none of this. Well, it works for me. There must be something wrong with your setup.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons we should be coordinating with them better. Because right now there's a slight impedance match between their tech and our tech.
Sorry, can I just ask, so what do you, I agree, Overleaf is great for collaboration. Are you looking for easy feedback through collaboration? Is that the reason?
No, we're just saying people write their papers in Overleaf. Therefore, if, to the extent Jonathan's talking about using the tools to promote accessibility, it would be great if we had the conversation with the Overleaf people about, hey, when people are defining tables or inserting figures, images, etc., could you harass them to put in the alt text and other stuff like that? Right? It's probably the most important nexus where we could accomplish a lot of that.
Some journals.
Archive is the second nexus that we could, scan their paper and say, hey, your accessibility score is this bad. Can you help fix this and that?
But it's further down the line, as you said. Yeah.
Christopher.
Yeah, some journals require that you use their their templates before you can publish. And yeah, if those templates required some packages that had accessibility features, then you'd kind of be guaranteed that people that publish to this.
Based on our research, Christopher, some do, and
Mhm.
it's a mess. This stuff gets recorded, so I should be careful about saying names. In particular, we've had people who are members of some of the professional societies and say, one part of the society makes me use this completely inaccessible template, the other tells me to use the accessible template, and we just haven't finished squaring the circle yet, or circling the square. I'm not sure which we do.
I'd say most journals do have some style file, but they're written mostly so that the roughly the right PDF comes out. And also the authors are then free to use, tech encourages you to write your own macros, etc. So it's difficult to keep people constrained.
At a previous meeting, somebody talked about, I think it was the fragmentation of the community. And that struck me quite strongly because it really does describe a lot of what we've got and a lot of the problem. And I like to think that unifying the community was one of the things that was motivating me in terms of looking for standards for HTML generation and looking for tools that are available to everybody that in the end everybody ends up using, or many people use. And for that to happen, and there are a number of basic properties that need to happen, one of which is user-focused design and a respect for people, and another of which is the traditional virtues of open source software. You want to say goodbye, Charles? You're on. We're now 5 minutes over the hour. Anybody that wants to make concluding remarks is very welcome to. I've enjoyed today, and we've had, I think, very interesting discussion, and hearing other points of view is always a bit difficult for me sometimes, but it's also leads to good results, leads to better results. I won't close the room after we've all said goodbye, because people can stay and talk if they want to.
I'm thinking of parallels with the car manufacturing industry, which started out as a Wild West and now has standardized parts. And I think the motivator there was cost. It lowers everybody's costs and means they can sell more cars. I don't know if there's a parallel in publishing, but that might be something that could gather different publishers together. Yeah,
there is a parallel in publishing. It goes all the way back to Gutenberg. It's movable type, interchangeable parts. So when you're typesetting the Bible or something, you have a whole bunch of little sticks of printing metal. I'll use the word lead, but it's printing metal. It's very special metal. And they've all got the letter A on it. And you've got a bunch of others that got the B on it and so forth. And you can use any of the A's. They're not different. There was a time when nuts and bolts came in pairs. And with precision manufacturing, you can have a box full of nuts and a box full of bolts, and every nut will fit every bolt. And the cost of parts that are not interchangeable is very, very high. Now, in automobiles, for high-performance planes in the Second World War and for racing cars, you want all the pistons to have exactly the same weight or very close to the same weight. Because if they've got different weights, then you get vibrations. And vibrations are deadly, or at least damaging. And the achievement of uniformity is drives down cost. It just makes everything straightforward. You know, every bag of sugar contains a kilo of sugar and costs the same amount. That's a great simplification. So I think, Shamsi, the uniformity you're talking about has been going on through culture for a very, very long time. And one of the early roles of the kings and monarchs was to determine lengths and weights and volumes, you know, 3 cubits and all that stuff. The determination of weights and measures goes back a long time.
I agree, Jonathan. If I can, but if we move forward a little bit, another thought came to mind from what Shamsi says. Absolutely. So if at the moment it costs to go from a paper, from a manuscript to a publication, and the cost is something like, if you look at open access charges, APCs, they range from a few $100s to $11,000 if you're in publishing in Nature, one of the Nature journals. So I would say if the publishers say, yep, we will if you follow these guidelines, we'll cut in half your APC, that's a great incentive.
But do you think that's really the reason for the cost? I mean, if you look at, for example, the SciPost journals, they are high quality open access journals, free to readers, free to authors. And they're covered by, they have some people who donate some money, but the cost per paper is orders of magnitude lower what normal journals. Okay. So I don't think that's the main motivation for Nature. I think it's probably just greed and profit.
Yeah, sorry, you're absolutely right that without sort of being diplomatic here. Right. So we deal with the production, if you like, we take author's manuscript, we give all the deliverables. But the difference between a journal that costs 500 APC to 5,000 APC is not that much, the quality of what comes out. So I agree with you. The costs are in other places, whatever they are. Yeah. But anyway, that's a challenge because publishers do mention that, you know, there's production costs and APCs and typesetting costs. So you could say, how about if I give you something? How about if I give you full XML? The publishers claim that they go from XML, their XML first. Everyone says that. If they really are doing that, there should be no costs because you drop this in. Apart from copy editing, there's no manual work in structuring. So if that doesn't work, then the question is, well, where is the difference in cost coming from? Yeah. I'm not an expert in the breakdown of cost. I just know, you know, our bit, if you like.
Either now or by email to me afterwards. I think there's a topic here that we can discuss for a full hour. But I wouldn't want to be the person that leads it.
Yeah, I would agree. Standardization would be a really interesting topic. Maybe we could think about who might lead that and who we might invite to lead it. It could be somebody from publishing.
Yeah, standards. You know the joke. Standards, of course we've got standards. We like standards. That's why we have so many of them. Christopher.
So there's been some, in the US, the government has recently changed the rules for to make a publicly funded research more available. I think you don't get to embargo it anymore. I'm wondering if we could use that requirement as a way to build feedback and leverage. Because now I think you could make the argument that making it available might include making it accessible. And so having a way that making an offering that says, okay, if you do this, then you're in compliance with the government's funding rules where you have to make your research available. Put it through this tool and make it accessible to be in compliance might be motivating. on
Christopher,
this end.
we've spoken to some legal scholars about that, and the connection has not been explicitly made yet with accessibility. The expectation is that it will be, that it's inevitable that that connection will be made at some point, but it hasn't been made yet, and it is frustrating.
So we could frame it as reducing their potential legal exposure in the future if they were to implement a standard now.
I think that's accurate. Potential legal risk is reduced.
I think
I
in some
always
countries, there already are some accessibility mandates for web pages if they're funded by tax money or whatever.
I think
University of
they're going
California,
that way.
Berkeley.
I mean, it's not clear. I put two links in there. One is the OSTP memo, which is more about open access, but it does touch on open science, etc. And I think it mentions accessibility. I can't remember, but there is also there is the UNESCO recommendation that goes much more into openness, inclusivity, including all people from everywhere, and I can't remember, but basically it goes much deeper into inclusivity and people partaking. So these two together, I think in the next 1 or 2 years, to be safe, people are going to go that way. And the UNESCO is, I've gone through that, and it's great, it's wonderful. Forgive me if it's self publicity here. I'll put a link. I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk at NISO, the standards people, specifically on this openness. So I'll put a link in there. There's a recording of how publishers, they're tearing their hair out. Publishers, what are we going to do here? How we can go from where we are to embracing all of OSTP and the UNESCO.
I would be very interested in listening to that talk. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a link there. I've got a shortcut to it, so I'm happy to discuss that. But that was it's really exciting what's happening now. It's very, very exciting. And I think publishers, if I were a publisher, I'd say, look, to be safe, guys, let's make everything accessible, because it's clearly coming. And UNESCO is not absolutely binding, but it's been ratified by about 200 nations. So it is a recommendation ratified by countries, including the US. So it's not going to go away.
You probably only need the top 1 or 2 publishers in each field to really adopt like these standards before it really much becomes what everybody does.
But of course, we don't know what the sorry to interrupt, but what the APCs, APCs could still be many thousands of dollars, but everything is open. What you want. However, for inclusivity, you can't have that. You cannot have someone from sub-Saharan Africa or the Amazon. A tribe, for example, who've got some data. We've got a paper published in one of our journals, Gigabyte. There's a tribe of 171 people in Brazilian Amazon, and they had some data about mosquito bite or some sort of bites, and that has been used with other data to give an interesting output. That's the kind of world that I like to move towards, to be honest.
I think it's really important that the problems we face are not viewed as being technical problems and nothing but technical problems. They are predominantly human problems. Even the technical problems are human problems, because if it didn't make any difference to anybody's life, then it's not a technical problem, it's a puzzle to entertain yourself with. So I'm pleased that we sort of open out and discuss these things that are going on in society. I've got a couple of comments about the history of tech. There were 2 big influences, I think. The first was the adoption of tech by the American Mathematical Society, which is a scholarly society, a learned society, one of the leading publishers of academic research in the United States and North America. And that did an enormous amount because they were the customer number one for tech for a long time. And they provide proof that tech could be used for publishing, because there it was working. And a lot of people followed it because it solved the problems of mathematical content. The second big influence, I think, was the rise of LaTeX, which arose from Lamport's work in digital equipment on documentation. And I think he had some sort of vision that, oddly enough, it's similar, I think, to, I flatter myself, my vision regarding having a writer for accessible HTML, which was large parts of the stuff you need for writing a tech document, writing the styles for a tech document, are common to all tech documents. And his job was to provide all of that, or a lot of that, and then make it easier for people to add the extra bits they needed. So it's a bit like providing the basics of an ice cream mix, and then you've got the chocolate chips and the flavorings and the pistachio nuts and everything else. So those were two big influences, the American Mathematical Society and Lamport's LaTeX. I think that the archive, you don't have to answer this because it's being recorded, but I can say it because it's being recorded. The archive has the potential to play a role regarding the next steps, the steps for the next 20 or 30 years, similar to the role that the American Mathematical Society played. And just as solving the problem of mathematical typesetting was the thing that the AMS adopted tech for, so solving the problem of STEM accessibility in terms of journals and books is perhaps the problem that will drive the next generation of, I won't use the word tech, I'll use the word technical digital typography for technical subjects. There we are, some bold statements to finish with. Anybody else can follow with whatever they want.
No pressure on archive, of course. But that would be
There must
great.
be thousands of people working for the archive. Look at all the stuff they publish.
No, it's
We know it's
amazing everything that comes out of archive. What was it, 15,000 a month or something? It's and it's been going for decades, literally. So, but it's this going from here to that full accessibility, and it's not an easy problem. It's key. It'd be wonderful.
Archive can't do it without the involvement of ordinary people. I came across tech because somebody where I was working had installed tech, or tech had been installed, and he started to learn it, and he gave a talk about it. And he mocked up the letterhead using tech to explain what tech was and how it worked. And at that point, I knew I wanted to know this better and learn it, because it allowed me to do mathematical typesetting. Now, if the archive solves the problem of STEM accessibility, then whatever tools it uses will become widely adopted for people that want to solve problems with STEM accessibility. So on the one hand, that's the reward, but on the other hand, I think it's an indication of the difficulty of the problem. And getting the engagement of ordinary users, I think, will be a very, very important part of the whole process.
I agree.
Words of wisdom, Jonathan. Can I ask a very specific question from our friends at Archive? If I don't know if you can answer this, but are we? I'm guessing accessibility in an HTML is easier than accessibility for a PDF file. Are you looking for accessibility in both, or what's the ideal goal here?
I can give a high level response to that. The goal is producing HTML alongside the other formats that are offered right now. Accessible PDF would also be great, but we're focusing on HTML because that's the direction we've received from our community and from accessibility experts and from users of arXiv who rely on assistive technology. That accessible PDF is great, but it can't equal accessible HTML. And in addition, and Christopher can speak to this, accessible HTML also serves other communities like machine readability. I don't know if you want to add to that, Christopher. That's more your field.
This is, I'd say, not in my capacity as a consultant with arXiv, but just as in almost the realm of sci-fi. In some disciplines, they've worked out ways to represent their data to make it machine accessible. It works in pharmacy, pharmacology. It works in genetics, and it allows these disciplines to turn over their data to algorithms and have the algorithms kind of reason, in a machine learning way about the data. They are able to design experiments and test drugs so that you can actually do automated discovery of new drugs because they found a way to represent their data and feed it to an algorithm. You could do automated discovery of the genetic underpinnings of different diseases because they have a way to represent it. And it would be amazing if we could find a way to represent an argument in a machine accessible way. That's actually a really hard problem. People in linguistics have been working on it for decades, but being able to represent the sort of meaning inherent in the text, separate from the text, but a data representation that captured the argument, captured the relationships among pieces of data, would potentially revolutionize the way we do science, because it would, instead of trying to teach computers to read written text, we would instead use a more accessible to a machine representation of our arguments and let them deal with that directly. It would be an amazing thing for science. It would, that would be, it could be the singularity, as we sometimes say, where suddenly machines can really access our ways of representing our thinking in a non-text way. But that's far in the future, mayhaps. But it's something that I think about when we talk about making text accessible to people. When we talk about doing semantic markup, representing the meaning in ways that are accessible to a machine reader, we might as well go the rest of the way and try to make it also accessible to algorithms, so we can enable some really exciting stuff in the future.
So machine learning, there's been very interesting developments in terms of the the artificial intelligence recognition of mathematical handwriting, and MathPix is the people who are doing that. And if that comes to fruition, then it will be easier to write our mathematics on a piece of paper and scan it than it will be to type out the LaTeX. I think that is not a threat, first of all, because it's not damaging. Secondly, it's not close yet, I think, but it's possible. You may not know, Christopher, but significant amounts of important mathematics have been formally proved. So the proof isn't, I'm an expert and I've written it and this is a proof, and I'm the reviewer and I'm expert and I've checked it and it's a proof. It's the computer saying, I've been told the rules to follow and it's proof.
Yeah, I should have mentioned mathematics as one of those areas where algorithms are.
Mathematics is one of the great outliers. But now that doesn't mean that the computer understands it, and it certainly doesn't mean the computer can generate the proof, but it can certainly, at this point, check the proof. And Lean has something called assistance, where you sort of state what you think is true, and then you say to Lean, well, have a go at proving it. And Lean might say, I could prove it if you can provide the answer to this. It's that sort of searching. And as I said, some significant parts of mathematics have been done, and the most exciting one is Peter Scholzer, who's an eminent Fields medalist, produced some revolutionary ideas in mathematics and believed that he had proved them, but he wanted to be sure that he had proved them because there's so much riding on it. And a group of people got together to formalize the proof. And it was a bit like writing software where the designer says, do this, do this. The programmer say, well, what do you mean by this? And what do you mean by that? And so there was this sort of feedback loop between the people who are sort of doing the formal proof and the person who was architecting everything. And enough of the stuff came through for Peter Scholzer and other people to have confidence that the thing actually had been proved. And I don't exactly know what it's about, but it allows you to do things in an entirely different way, as long as a certain technical result holds. And so you really want that technical result to be proved quite carefully. And that gave a really big impetus in the research community to formal methods of proof. That's more than anybody expected.
But just a point that from what Christopher was saying, traditionally, all science is actually narrative based. We are used to writing things down. You write it down and a human has to read it. You can do artificial intelligence and machine learning, but wouldn't it be nice if, as the author is writing, they're encouraged to put semantics into the text. Simple example, and I'll blame Charles is gone, so I can blame Microsoft for this. I would say when Microsoft came along, basically we got one word processor in the world. It's called Microsoft Word, and the only thing we have to identify one word or a sentence or a phrase is bold, italic, or font size. That's it. So all of the world's information is actually encoded in 3 or 4 font characteristics. Now, if you're a lawyer, you know that you make this bold if I don't know, you're a defendant. If you're a chemist, you make it bold if it's, something else. Wouldn't it be nice if instead of saying bold, something pops up and say, yeah, this is a ligand, whatever that is, or this is a vector. That would go at least some part of the way in putting meaning into the text. And the text can come out later, you can read it, but behind, as you say, behind the scenes, in the file, there is meaning in there. That's what I'd like to see. There used to be lots of word processors, and each of them had nuances, and we could have had lots of. Somebody would have come up with something that embeds meaning, but there's no choice now. We got to use Word or Tech, one of the two.
HTML5 introduced several semantic markup tags that I found to be really interesting. They instead of just having bold and italics, now they have new things like emphasis, strong, definition, abbreviation, like all these little things that you could add that I found really interesting. And also some of them are counterintuitive. Italics now, when you use emphasis, it actually is supposed to be you're emphasizing a term in a way that changes the meaning of the sentence, which is different from strong, where you use it to emphasize that part of the sentence. I wouldn't have necessarily thought those were the right definitions, but it's interesting. They're standardized now.
Basic semantics. You're absolutely right. And we use that, I think, when we're typing, we put M for emphasis. And I think Tech has a \M, Jonathan?
Yeah. If you're in italic text and you want to emphasize something, then you have to use upright.
Well, you say emphasis, and Tech automatically makes it upright because it's the opposite of what you're writing. So that's a little bit of.
It's LaTeX that's doing that rather than
LaTeX. Okay, correct. Yeah. That's it. LaTeX has got. It's such a long time since I used it, but
these things are social constructions. Bruno Latour died recently. I think it was Bruno. He was French philosopher, and one of his things was the role of society in the construction of scientific facts. And that was a bit controversial to begin with, but the role of society, but it predicted in some sense the climate change deniers, for example, that what gets accepted as a fact is a social construct. A fact is a social construct, just as money is a social construct. And the various forms of semantics that we have are in some sense social constructs, and the means we have for, so sarcasm is a social construct.
Mhm.
For example.
Huh, so we're gonna go back to having to, your document has to come along with a social grammar so you can parse it right again.
No, it comes with a social grammar. It's you know, if you listen to a comedy radio program, that's if you know it's a comedy program, that provides the social context for it. And even in the proceedings of Parliament or something, the different social context allows people to speak in a different sort of way. We're not just individuals. We have a collective life as well.
You'd like some way to represent all that context we bring with us when it comes to parsing a document. And so that, it's otherwise, computers are notoriously bad at that, you know. It's yeah, they're very literal. They take what's on the page. The context is harder to build in. So there's